The year is 1876. In the heart of the unforgiving American West, a lone rider, haunted by a past he cannot outrun, carries a secret that could shatter the fragile peace between settlers and the native tribes. With a storm brewing on the horizon and enemies closing in from all sides, he must make a choice: protect his secret and save himself, or risk everything for a future he may not live to see. The dust of the trail holds memories of love, loss, and betrayal, and every sunset brings him closer to a reckoning that will forever mark this land.
The sun was a merciless god in this part of the country, a blazing eye in a bleached white sky. It baked the alkali flats into a cracked mosaic and beat down upon the lone figure moving across it, turning the sweat on his brow to salt before it could fall. His name, for now, was Silas. It wasn't the name he was born with, but the one he had chosen, a hard, simple name for a hard, simple existence, or so he told himself. He rode a rangy bay gelding, a creature as lean and enduring as himself, its coat the color of dried blood under the relentless glare. Man and horse moved as one, a singular dark speck against the immense, indifferent landscape of the Arizona Territory. To the east, the serrated peaks of the Dragoon Mountains clawed at the sky. To the west, nothing but shimmering heat and the promise of more dust. Silas kept his hat, a stained and shapeless thing, pulled low. It wasn't just to shield his eyes from the sun, but to hide the story they told. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and cold, and they held the kind of haunted stillness that comes from seeing too much of the world's ugliness. A lattice of fine lines radiated from their corners, etched not by laughter, but by countless hours of squinting into the sun and the darker shadows of men's hearts. A scar, thin and white, cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline, a permanent reminder of a debt paid in violence. His past was a ghost that rode a few paces behind him, his cold breath on his neck, even in the suffocating heat. It was a collection of fractured images, the smell of pine and gunpowder, the splintering of a cabin door, a woman's scream swallowed by the thunder of a gunshot, the weight of a promise he was failing to keep. He pushed the thoughts away, as he always did, packing them down into the hard, barren soil of his memory. Thinking did no good, riding did. As long as he was moving, the ghost couldn't quite catch him. For 3 days he had seen no one. The land was empty, scoured clean of life save for the buzzards that circled high overhead on lazy currents of air, patient as death itself. He navigated by the sun and the stars, his course set for a small fledgling settlement called Redemption, a town with a name far too optimistic for the land it occupied. He wasn't seeking redemption himself. He was long past that. He was looking for information, a whisper on the wind, a name, the name of the man who had turned his life to ash. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, the character of the landscape began to change. The flats gave way to rolling, scrub-dotted hills and jagged rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient, forgotten beasts. It was here, in the deepening shadows, that Silas felt a familiar prickle on his skin, the feeling of being watched. He didn't stop or turn his head. His posture remained relaxed, his hand resting easy on his thigh, inches from the worn wooden grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered there. But his senses sharpened. He listened to the rhythmic clip-clop of his horse's hooves on the rocky ground, the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of a hawk. He sorted through the sounds, searching for the one that didn't belong. The scuff of a boot, the click of a rifle hammer, the rustle of clothing. Nothing. Yet the feeling persisted. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and they were screaming now. He guided the bay behind a tall outcropping of red rock, dismounting in one fluid motion. The horse stood ground-hitched, perfectly still, as Silas unslung the Winchester rifle from his saddle. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and economical. He climbed the rocks, his worn boots finding purchase where it seemed there was none. From the top, he scanned the back trail, his eyes missing nothing. The land was a tapestry of rock and shadow, empty and vast. He waited, motionless, for a full 10 minutes, letting the silence settle. He saw the flicker of movement then, so small he almost missed it. On a ridge nearly a mile back, the sun glinted off something metallic. A spyglass. They weren't sloppy, whoever they were. They were keeping their distance. Not bandits then. Bandits were impatient. They would have ambushed him in the rocks. This was different. This was a pursuit. A cold knot tightened in his gut. He had been careful, covering his tracks, paying in cash, never staying in one place for more than a night. But the past had a long reach. He slid back down the rocks and swung into the saddle. He didn't spur the horse into a gallop. That would be a waste of precious energy. Instead, he urged the bay into a steady, ground-eating trot, pushing deeper into the broken country where the shadows were his only allies. The central conflict of his life, the one he had been running from for 2 years, was no longer a ghost at his back. It had taken form. It was on his trail. As dusk bled into night, he pressed on, the moon a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. He thought of redemption, the town ahead. It was meant to be a place to gather information, to listen. Now, it was a potential trap. But turning back was not an option. The man he was hunting, a land baron named Alastair Finch, was rumored to have interests in the area. Finch, a man who built his empire on the graves of those who stood in his way. A man who had taken everything from Silas. Sometime after midnight, he crested a final high ridge. Below him, nestled in a shallow valley and clinging to the banks of a winding creek, were the faint, flickering lights of a few dozen lamps. Redemption. But something was wrong. A different kind of light pulsed from the far side of the settlement, an angry, hungry orange glow that danced against the dark canvas of the hills. Smoke, thick and black, billowed into the night sky, carrying with it the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet smell of burning pine, and something else, something worse. He pulled the bay to a halt, his hand resting on the rifle in his lap. The watchers on his trail, this fire in the valley, they were connected. He could feel it in his bones. He was riding not towards a sanctuary, but into the heart of a conflict that had already begun. The ghost of his past was no longer just behind him. It was waiting for him, down there, in the whispering, burning dark of redemption.
Silas nudged the bay forward, descending from the ridge into the valley of redemption. He moved not toward the flickering lamps of the town, but toward the angry orange glow that stained the night sky. The smell grew stronger as he approached. Acrid smoke, the scent of green wood burning, and the gut-wrenching odor of scorched earth and ruined hopes. He dismounted at the edge of the firelight, keeping to the shadows cast by a line of cottonwood trees that bordered the creek. The scene before him was one of quiet devastation. What had once been a sturdy log homestead was now a roaring pyre, its frame collapsing inward, sending up a geyser of sparks that danced like malevolent spirits against the darkness. A smaller structure, likely a barn, was a blackened skeletal ruin. A small crowd of settlers stood silhouetted against the flames, their faces grim, their bodies slumped in a collective posture of defeat and fear. They spoke in low, hushed tones, the sound swallowed by the crackle and roar of the fire. This was the source of the whispers. It wasn't gossip. It was fear given a voice. A woman's raw sob cut through the night, and Silas's eyes were drawn to her. She stood slightly apart, clutching the hands of 2 small children, her face a mask of disbelief. Near her, a man sat on the ground, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. But it was a third figure that held Silas's attention. A young woman, barely out of her teens, stood ramrod straight, her fists clenched at her sides. Her face, illuminated by the hellish light, was smudged with soot and streaked with tears, but her eyes burned with fire that rivaled the one consuming her home. There was no defeat in her gaze, only a cold, hard fury. This was the headstrong homesteader destiny had waiting for him. "It was Finch's men," she said, her voice clear and carrying, cutting through the murmurs. "I saw them, 3 riders, heading east." An older man with a drooping mustache and a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to his vest shuffled his feet. "Now, Sarah, you can't know that for sure. The light plays tricks. Could have been anybody. Apaches, maybe." "Apaches don't douse a barn in kerosene before they light it," she snapped back, her voice dripping with contempt. "And they don't ride horses shod by the blacksmith in town. I know the sound of them. This was a message from Alistair Finch. He wants this valley, and he'll burn out anyone who won't sell." The sheriff looked away, unable to meet her furious glare. "We don't have proof." "This is your proof," she cried, flinging a hand toward the inferno. "Or are you too scared of him to see it?" The sheriff's face hardened, but he offered no reply. The other settlers exchanged nervous glances, their silence a testament to the power of the name she had spoken. Finch. It hung in the air, heavier and more suffocating than the smoke. Silas had his confirmation. He had ridden into the right place. As he watched, he felt that familiar prickle on his neck again, the sense of being observed. He didn't move his head, but let his eyes drift to the periphery. There, standing half-hidden in the deep shadow of a large boulder, was another man. He was tall and lean, his features hard to make out in the gloom, but he was clearly not one of the settlers. He wore buckskin leggings, and his long dark hair was tied back with a simple leather cord. He was still as the stone he stood beside, his attention not on the fire, but on the ground, studying the tracks left in the chaos. The wise Native American scout. Silas detached himself from the tree line and walked his horse slowly toward the scene. His appearance caused a ripple of alarm. Every head turned, and conversations died mid-whisper. A stranger, armed and coated in trail dust, appearing out of the darkness on a night like this was another cause for fear. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands in plain sight. He nodded toward the sheriff. "What happened here?" "Who's askin'?" The sheriff eyed him with suspicion. "Just a traveler, named Silas." Before the sheriff could respond, Sarah stepped forward, wiping her face with the back of a dirty hand. "Finch's men happened here," she said, her eyes boring into Silas, challenging him. "They burned us out, just like they did the Millers last month." "I'm sorry for your trouble, ma'am," Silas said, his voice low and even. His gaze flickered for a moment, meeting the eyes of the man in the shadows. For a heartbeat, their worlds connected. They were two of a kind, outsiders, observers, men who understood the language of violence and the secrets of the land. The man gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a fellow predator. Silas turned his attention back to the town proper, leading his horse down the wide, rusted track that served as Redemption's main street. It was a town clinging to life by a thread. A single saloon, its batwing doors spilling yellow light and the tinny sound of a piano onto the street, sat opposite a general store with boarded-up windows. Further down was a blacksmith's forge, dark and silent, and the skeletal frame of a church that had been abandoned mid-construction. Everywhere there was a sense of impermanence, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for a wind to come and blow it all away. He tied the bay to the hitching rail outside the saloon and pushed through the doors. The piano player stopped, his hands hovering over the keys. Every patron, a handful of dusty ranchers and 3 hard-looking men playing poker at a back table, turned to stare. The silence was thick with suspicion. Silas ignored them, walking to the bar. "Whiskey," he said to the paunchy bartender, who was nervously polishing an already clean glass. He took the glass and leaned against the bar, not drinking, but listening. "Told him Finch's offer was final," one of the ranchers murmured to his companion. "$1 an acre. It's theft." "It's that or the torch," the other replied, glancing at the 3 men at the poker table. "We all know who works for him." Silas followed his gaze. The 3 men were better dressed than the others, their guns new, their faces wearing the smug arrogance of bullies who know they have the backing of a powerful man. One of them caught Silas looking and sneered, a silent threat that needed no words. Silas simply held his gaze, his expression unreadable, until the man looked away, unnerved by the cold emptiness in the stranger's eyes. He finished his whiskey in one swallow, the cheap liquor burning a path down his throat. He had found what he came for. Finch wasn't just a ghost from his past. He was an active poison, corrupting everything he touched. His private war had led him to a public one. He paid the bartender and asked for a room. The only lodging was a small room above the saloon. From its single grimy window, he could look out over the entire settlement. The fire at the homestead had died down to a pulsing, hellish bed of embers. Most of the townsfolk had returned to their own homes to lock their doors and pray the night would pass without further incident. But 2 figures remained. Down by the creek, Sarah stood guard over the smoking ruins of her life. She held a long rifle, and even from this distance, Silas could see the rigid set of her shoulders, a lone sentinel of defiance. And then he saw another movement. From the shadows near the boulder, the scout, Cale, emerged. He didn't approach Sarah, but moved like a phantom into the darkened hills that overlooked the valley, finding a high vantage point where he could watch over the town, a protector from the margins. Silas watched them both, these 2 disparate souls bound by a common enemy, a headstrong girl who would not be broken, and a silent watcher who saw more than he let on. He had come to redemption seeking the end of his own story, a final confrontation with the man who had wronged him. But as he looked over the whispering, wounded settlement, he knew his path had irrevocably merged with theirs. The simmering tensions of this fledgling town were about to boil over, and he, the ghost from the horizon, was now standing right in the middle of the fire. Dawn broke over redemption, not with a gentle blush, but with a harsh, gray light that made the valley look like a fresh wound. The smoke from the burned-out homestead had thinned to a hazy plume, a grim monument against the morning sky. From his window above the saloon, Silas watched the town stir to a fearful, muted life. Doors opened a crack and were quickly shut. People moved with hurried, furtive steps, their eyes cast downward, as if afraid the sky itself might pass judgment. Fear was a sickness, and Alistair Finch had infected this entire settlement. Silas buckled on his gun belt, the familiar weight a cold comfort. He had come here for a singular purpose, to find a trail that led to Finch and extinguish it. He had not accounted for getting entangled in the town's silent war. Yet as he looked down at the smoldering ruins, he knew his path and the town's had become one. Finch's methods were a signature, and this fire was written in the same hand as the one that had destroyed his own life. He descended the creaking stairs and stepped out into the chilly morning air. Instead of heading for the general store, he walked directly toward the devastation. Sarah was already there, sifting through the blackened debris with a desperate, methodical focus. The fire in her eyes from the night before had not dimmed. It had hardened into something cold and sharp like forged steel. She clutched a small, soot-covered tin box to her chest, perhaps the only thing she had managed to save. She heard his footsteps on the scorched earth and straightened up, her body tensing. She held a heavy iron poker in her hand, gripping it like a weapon. "Here to pick over the bones?" she asked, her voice raspy from smoke and grief. "No," Silas replied, stopping a few yards away. He scanned the area, his gaze sweeping over the ground, the burned structures, the surrounding terrain. "Their tracks are gone. The crowd from last night trampled everything." Sarah's eyes narrowed. The sheriff said the same thing, gave up before he even started looking. "The sheriff's afraid," Silas stated, "not as a judgment, but as a fact. He's afraid to find anything that points to Finch." "And you're not?" The question was a challenge, sharp and pointed. "I've got my own reasons for not being afraid of Alistair Finch," he said, his voice flat. He pointed with his chin toward the creek bed. "They came from the east, you said, but they didn't leave that way. They doubled back through the water to hide their trail and exited south behind that ridge." Sarah's defiant expression faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of surprise. She looked from Silas to the creek and back again. "How could you know that?" "Because that's what I would have done," he answered simply. "And because the ferns on the south bank are broken. A horse pushed through there in the last 10 hours. Before she could process this, a third voice joined their conversation, smooth and quiet as a river stone. They split up 2 miles south. 2 riders went toward the mining camp. The third cut west toward the mesa. Silas and Sarah turned. The Native American scout stood at the edge of the clearing, having approached with a silence that was both unnerving and impressive. He moved with an effortless grace, his eyes dark and intelligent, taking in everything. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows on his back, but it was the long-bladed knife at his hip that looked most dangerous. Sarah stared at him with open suspicion. In this territory, settlers were taught to fear men who looked like him. "Who are you?" "He is Cale," Silas answered for him, having heard the name whispered in the saloon. He had seen the scout watching from the rocks, and knew this was a man who understood the landscape as a living thing. Cale's gaze settled on Silas, sharp and appraising. "You see more than most white men." "I've learned to," Silas said. An uncomfortable silence fell between the three of them, a triangle of mistrust amidst the ruins. They were a microcosm of the West itself, the homesteader, clinging fiercely to a piece of land, the native whose land it had once been, and the gunslinger, a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere. Sarah broke the silence, her anger returning. "So you know where they went. What good does that do? The sheriff won't listen, and no one in this town has the spine to ride after them." "Then we will." The statement hung in the air, audacious and deadly. Sarah stared at him, a storm of emotions crossing her face, disbelief, a desperate spark of hope, and overwhelming suspicion. "We? There is no we. I don't know you from Adam, and I've been told my whole life not to trust his kind." She nodded curtly toward Cale. Cale's expression remained unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "And my people have learned through blood and betrayal what a settler's word is worth. Your fight is with Finch, not with me. Finch drives the deer from the forest and poisons the rivers with his mines. He tears up the land and respects no boundaries. His sickness will spread to your people soon enough. It always does." Cale's silence was a tacit admission that Silas spoke the truth. "Why should you care?" she demanded, turning her focus back to Silas. "What's your stake in this? Drifters don't risk their necks for strangers." For a long moment, Silas didn't answer. The ghost of his past rose up, whispering of fire and loss. He could see his wife's face, hear the echo of her laughter. He pushed it all back down. "Let's just say Finch and I have a history. I'm not here to save your town. I'm here to kill him." The raw, cold venom in his voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise. It stripped away Sarah's suspicion and left behind a stark understanding. This man was not a hero. He was a hunter, and they just happened to be chasing the same prey. "I can't pay you," she said, her voice dropping. "I don't want your money. I want your knowledge. You know the area. You know Finch's operations, who he employs, where he keeps his men." Then he turned to Cale. "And you can track a ghost through a windstorm. You know the secret ways through these mountains, the places a man can watch without being seen. Finch's men are confident because they think no one can follow them. You can prove them wrong." The proposition settled over them, heavy and dangerous. It was a mad idea. The three of them against a man who had the territory's laws in his pocket and a small army of hired guns on his payroll. It was suicide, but it was also the only option any of them had. Cale was the first to speak, his voice still low and measured. "The man who went west, he is the one who leads the others. He carries a repeating rifle with a silver hawk carved in the stock. I have seen him before. He is Finch's right hand." Sarah's breath hitched. "Jedediah Kane. He's a monster. He's the one who—" She couldn't finish, gesturing helplessly at the smoking ruin of her home. "Then he's the one we go after first," Silas declared. "You cut off the head of the snake's dog, and the master will come looking." The alliance was forged not with a handshake or a promise, but with a shared, silent acknowledgement of a brutal reality. They were three desperate people, united only by their hatred for a common enemy. Sarah, fueled by fresh grief and a will of iron. Cale, the quiet protector of a dying way of life. And Silas, the ghost, driven by a cold, all-consuming need for revenge. "I'll need a horse," Sarah said, her voice firm, all trace of the victim gone. "And my father's rifle." Cale gave a single sharp nod. "The trail will be cold by noon. We leave in an hour." He turned and melted back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Silas looked at Sarah, seeing the fierce resolve in her soot-stained face. He saw a mirror of his own loss, twisted into a different shape. "This won't be easy. You'll see things that will change you." "I've already been changed," she said, her knuckles white around the poker. "Now I'm just looking to return the favor." Standing there in the graveyard of one family's dream, the most unlikely and dangerous of partnerships was born. It was an uneasy alliance, a volatile mixture of vengeance, justice, and survival, destined either to cut a righteous path through Finch's empire or burn them all to ash. 50 miles east of Redemption, where the scorched Badlands gave way to greener, more promising territory, Alistair Finch surveyed his burgeoning empire. He did not survey it from the back of a horse, caked in the dust and sweat of the land he was conquering. He did so from the comfort of a leather armchair, set upon a Persian rug that had been carefully laid over the hard-packed earth. His camp was a testament to his philosophy. Impose civilization upon the wilderness, bend it to your will, and if it refuses to bend, break it. It was a small city of canvas and timber, meticulously organized. There were rows of tents for his surveyors, his armed guards, and his laborers. A large cook tent billowed savory-smelling smoke, and a makeshift assay office was processing core samples from the nearby hills. It was an operation of methodical, industrial-scale acquisition. Finch himself was a man who seemed entirely out of place, yet completely in command. He was dressed in a tailored wool suit, a silk cravat at his throat, his black boots polished to a mirror shine. His silvering hair was perfectly combed, and his hands, resting on the arms of his chair, were soft and manicured. He looked more like a banker from Boston than a frontier land baron, and in a way, he was. The West to him was not a place of freedom and opportunity, but a vast, untamed stock portfolio waiting for a hostile takeover. Before him, on a large oak table, was a detailed map of the entire territory. It was a beautiful piece of cartography, but Finch had desecrated it. Areas were marked off in different colors of ink: red for land acquired, blue for parcels under negotiation, and black for those whose owners were proving stubborn. The Valley of Redemption and Sarah's homestead within it was outlined in black. He held a silver letter opener, its tip hovering over the map. With a flick of his wrist, he drew a thin red line through the black outlined property. Another asset liquidated, another problem solved. A rider approached, dismounting with a jangle of spurs. It was Jedediah Kane, his right-hand man. The rifle with the silver hawk carved into the stock was in his saddle scabbard, and his face was a mask of grim efficiency. He removed his hat, revealing a slick of sweat on his brow, but his posture was deferential. "Mr. Finch," Kane said, his voice a low gravel, "it's done. The Henderson place is ash." Finch did not look up from his map immediately. He took a moment to carefully dip a quill into a pot of red ink and shade in the box that represented the Henderson homestead. Only then did he lift his cold, gray eyes to his subordinate. "Were there any complications, Jedediah?" Finch asked, his voice calm and cultured, a stark contrast to Kane's rough growl. "The girl, Sarah, she was there, got away before we could secure the scene." Finch tapped the letter opener on the table, the rhythmic tick, 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 the only sound for a long moment. "An untidy loose end, Jedediah. I dislike untidiness. It speaks of a lack of foresight." "She's just a girl, grieving. She'll be no trouble," Kane said, a touch of defensiveness in his tone. "Grief is a powerful motivator. It can make people foolish. It can make them brave. And foolish, brave people can be exceptionally troublesome. Did she see you?" "It was dark, but she's telling anyone who will listen it was our brand on the horses." Finch sighed, a sound of mild disappointment, as if a clerk had made a minor error in a ledger. "And is anyone listening?" "Sheriff Miller is doing his job, calling it an Apache raid. The rest of the town is too scared to spit without your permission. But there's something else." Kane hesitated. "A stranger rode in the same night. A drifter. Goes by Silas. He's been seen talking to the Henderson girl." The name meant nothing to Finch. The world was full of drifters, human debris blowing in the wind. "Describe him." "Quiet. Keeps to himself. But the way he moves, he's no farmer. He's seen trouble. And he wears a coat like he was born with it." Kane paused again. "There's also the matter of the scout, Cale. He's been seen on the ridges watching. He's with them now. The three of them rode west out of town this morning." Finch finally leaned back in his chair, steepling his soft fingers. He stared out at the sprawling camp, at the men working for him, at the land being systematically tamed and catalogued. His greed was not a simple brutish thing. It was a grand vision. He had seen the survey maps from the Union Pacific. He knew with absolute certainty that the coming railroad would cut directly through this territory. The valleys that were now worth $1 an acre would soon be worth 100. The hills, which the settlers saw as pasture land, were filled with copper and silver, and he had the geological reports to prove it. He wasn't just grabbing land, he was seizing the future. These settlers, with their pathetic dreams of family farms and peaceful lives, were not people to him. They were squatters on his future fortune. They were obstacles. And obstacles, in Alistair Finch's world, were always removed. A grieving girl, a half-wild Indian, and a nameless drifter. Finch mused, a faint condescending smile touching his lips. "They are following you, I presume?" "His trail, yes," Kane confirmed. "The scout is good. He would have picked it up." "Excellent," Finch said, the word startling Kane. "Let them follow. Lead them into the mesas. It's wild country, treacherous. Accidents happen there all the time. A rock slide, a sudden storm, a misunderstanding with a band of Apaches who might be encouraged to be in the area." He leaned forward again, his eyes locking with Kane's. The civility vanished, replaced by the cold, dead certainty of absolute command. "I want this handled, Jedediah, quietly and permanently. I am in the final stages of acquiring the water rights to the entire Black Creek Basin. I cannot be distracted by the buzzing of gnats. Take 2 men, eliminate the problem, and bring me back that rifle of her father's as a souvenir. It will serve as a fine reminder to the other black-inked names on my map that defiance has a cost." Kane nodded, his expression hardening with renewed purpose. "Consider it done." As Kane turned and walked away, his spurs kicking up dust from the imported rug, Finch's attention returned to his map. His gaze swept over the colored parcels, the lines of ownership, the topographical marks that represented mountains and rivers. He saw none of the beauty or the majesty. He saw only a grid of assets and liabilities. He picked up another document from the table, a letter from his investors in San Francisco, congratulating him on the speed and efficiency of his acquisitions. He allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. He was a builder, an architect of empire. Men like Jacob Kane, the Henderson family, and all the others were merely the timber that had to be cleared before the foundation could be laid. The name Jacob Kane flickered in his memory for a moment, the rancher from Montana, the man with the beautiful wife and the stubborn pride, a loose end from years ago that had, thankfully, been tied up and buried. He dismissed the thought. The past was irrelevant. Only the future, a future he was meticulously designing, mattered. Unbeknownst to him, the ghost of that past was riding hard under the Arizona sun, his face set like stone, a forgotten deed resting against his heart, and a promise of vengeance burning in his soul.
Silas rode with his back to the rising sun, leaving the broken alliance and the wounded scout in his dust. Each league he put between himself and redemption was a confirmation of the grim lesson his life had taught him. Attachments were anchors, and trust was a fool's currency. He was a ghost again, a solitary hunter with a singular purpose, Alistair Finch. His path was a straight line of vengeance, and he had allowed it to be diverted for too long. But the silence of the wilderness, usually a comfort, offered none. It was filled with the echoes of his own harsh words to Sarah, the image of Cale's stoic acceptance of his wound, and the ghost of Amelia whispering that he was choosing the same lonely path that had failed to save her. He was riding west, but his conscience was being dragged eastward, back toward the town he had resolved to abandon. He was a half-day's ride away when he saw it. Not a plume of smoke from a single homestead, but a thick, greasy column of black smoke, rising from the direction of the valley. It was the kind of smoke that spoke of deliberate destruction, of kerosene and rage. It was Finch's signature, written large against the sky. His horse slowed without a command, its ears twitching. His gut twisted into a cold, hard knot. This wasn't about Sarah or Cale anymore. This was Finch's answer to their defiance, an answer aimed at the entire settlement. He had run from one burning home. He could not bring himself to run from another. With a curse that was swallowed by the wind, Silas wrenched the reins and turned the bay back toward redemption. He arrived on the eastern ridge as the afternoon sun began to bleed toward the horizon, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. Redemption was under attack. At least a dozen of Finch's men, led by the unmistakable figure of Jedediah Kane, had descended upon the town. They weren't conducting a raid, they were executing a military occupation. The general store, its front windows blazing, was the source of the smoke. Kane's men were using it as a funeral pyre to break the town's spirit. Riders patrolled the main street, their rifles keeping the townsfolk pinned inside their homes. They had taken control of the livery and the blacksmith's forge, effectively cutting off any escape. Crimson Creek, the town's lifeblood, was under their guard, preventing anyone from getting water. It was a classic siege, designed to strangle the town into submission. From his vantage point, Silas saw flickers of resistance. A muzzle flash from the sheriff's office, a defiant shot from the second story of the saloon. But it was disorganized, desperate, and ultimately futile. Kane's men were professionals, moving with brutal efficiency, and it was only a matter of time before they crushed the last pockets of courage. Then he saw her, Sarah. She was not hiding. She, along with her father's rifle and 3 other townsmen, had fortified the small half-built church at the edge of town. Its stone foundation and thick unfinished walls offered the best cover they had. From its empty window frames, they were laying down a surprisingly effective fire, keeping Kane's men from completely overwhelming the center of town. Her guilt had been forged into a weapon. She had helped bring this fire down on Redemption, and she was determined to be the one to help put it out. He also saw Cale. Perched in the small bell tower of that same church, the scout was a silent specter of death. Despite the dark stain on his shoulder, he drew his bow with a steady, fluid motion, sending arrows into the fray with lethal precision. Each shot found a mark, an unseen threat from an unexpected angle, sowing confusion and fear among the attackers. But there were too many of them. Silas watched as Kane directed 2 of his men to haul a heavy farm wagon into the middle of the street. They were going to use it as a moving barricade to advance on the church. The courage of its defenders was admirable, but it couldn't stand against tactics and numbers. They needed a miracle. They needed a ghost. Silas dismounted, leaving his horse in a hidden ravine. He took his Winchester and a small canvas bag of cartridges and began to move. He did not charge in. He melted into the landscape, using the creek bed as a covered path, its shallow water silencing his footsteps. He circled around the southern edge of the town, his mind a cold, calculating machine, assessing angles, identifying targets, and formulating a strategy. He would not be the frontal assault. He would be the unseen cancer that ate the siege from the inside out. His first target was a sniper Kane had positioned on the roof of the saloon, who had the church's defenders pinned down. Silas took up a position behind a stack of rain barrels in an alleyway 100 yards away. He waited for him to lean out to take a shot, the setting sun glinting off his rifle barrel. Silas's Winchester cracked once. The man on the roof slumped forward and didn't move again. Inside the church, Sarah saw the sniper vanish. A moment of confusion, a breath of relief. "Where did that come from?" one of the townsmen asked. Sarah didn't know, but a wild, impossible hope sparked in her chest. Silas moved again, a shadow flitting between buildings. His next targets were the 2 men guarding the creek. Their attention was on the town, not on the whispering reeds behind them. He was on them before they could even turn, the butt of his rifle and a cold, hard fist taking them out of the fight without a sound. Jedediah Kane felt the shift. The sniper on the saloon was silent. The pressure on the church had lessened. His men were getting nervous, seeing threats in every shadow. His siege, so perfectly executed, was beginning to fray at the edges. "Find him!" Kane roared, his voice echoing down the main street. "Whoever it is, find him and kill him!" But hunting a ghost is an impossible task. Silas used the town as his weapon. He started a small fire in a hay-filled wagon near the livery, creating a diversion of smoke and panic that drew several of Kane's men away from the main fight. While they were distracted, Silas climbed to the roof of the blacksmith shop, giving him a commanding view of the street. From their fortress in the church, Sarah and Cale saw the fire, saw the men move toward it, and understood. It wasn't a miracle. It was Silas. He had come back. Hope, sharp and potent, surged through Sarah. They weren't just fighting a losing battle anymore. They were part of a coordinated defense. As Cale's arrows continued to harass the men in the street, Sarah and the others focused their fire on the group trying to advance with the wagon, driving them back into cover. For the first time, the courage of Redemption's inhabitants was not a liability. It was a critical part of a larger strategy. The old sheriff, seeing the tide turning, found a spine he thought long lost. He and his deputy opened fire from their office, catching a pair of Kane's men in a crossfire between themselves and Silas. The siege was devolving into chaos for the attackers. They were being hit from 3 sides. Their commander was screaming orders, and an unseen rifleman was picking them off one by one. Their confidence shattered, replaced by the primal fear of a hunter who has suddenly become the hunted. Kane, his face purple with rage, saw his control slipping. He fired his own rifle wildly at the rooftops, a gesture of pure frustration. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated the town's resolve, and he had fatally underestimated the ghost that had returned to haunt him. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruise purple and blood orange, Kane made his choice. This was no longer a simple siege. It was a battle he was losing. "Fall back," he bellowed. "Back to the ridge. We'll burn them out at dawn." His men needed no further encouragement. They scrambled for their horses, firing blindly as they retreated from the town they had so arrogantly occupied hours before. They galloped out of Redemption, leaving behind their dead and wounded. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning general store and the whimpering of an injured man. The first assault was over. Slowly, tentatively, the defenders emerged. Sarah, her face smeared with soot and her hands trembling, stepped out of the church. Cale descended from the bell tower, his movements stiff with pain. The sheriff and a few others came out into the street, their expressions a mixture of shock, grief, and triumphant disbelief. Then, from the alleyway beside the blacksmith's, Silas appeared. He walked into the center of the street, his Winchester held loosely in one hand, his face grim in the firelight. He looked at the devastation, at the bodies of Finch's men, and then his eyes met Sarah's. There were no apologies, no explanations. Words were useless now. The fragile trust that had been broken in the mesas had not been mended, but replaced by something harder and more real. A partnership reforged in gunpowder and shared survival. He had left them. He had come back. They were all still alive. "They'll be back," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden stillness. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The siege at Crimson Creek had only just begun.
The fragile victory was a flickering candle in a hurricane. As night fell over Redemption, the fire from the general store cast long, dancing shadows that looked like Finch's men regrouping on the ridges. The town was safe, but only for a moment. They had won a battle, but the war for their survival had just begun. A makeshift council was held in the cavernous, half-built church that had served as their fortress. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. By the flickering light of a few precious lanterns, Silas, Sarah, and Cale met with Sheriff Miller and the handful of townsmen who had found their courage. "They'll be back at dawn," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with grim certainty. "And there won't be a dozen riders this time. Kane will bring every gun Finch has. They won't try to occupy the town. They'll wipe it off the map." A heavy silence fell over the small group. They had fought bravely, miraculously, but they all knew the sheriff spoke the truth. They had 4, maybe 5 able-bodied men left with enough fight in them, a wounded scout, and a girl who fought with the fury of a cornered wolf. It wasn't enough. "We can't win a straight fight," Silas stated, his voice cutting through the despair. "We can't outlast a siege. We need help. We need the law." Sheriff Miller gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "The law, son. Alistair Finch is the law in this territory. The circuit judge is on his payroll, and the nearest cavalry post is at Fort Grant, 2 days' hard ride from here. They won't act without a direct order from a federal authority, and Finch has made sure that authority turns a blind eye." "Then we have to make them see," Silas replied. His hand went to his chest, to the oilskin pouch he wore beneath his shirt. He pulled the leather thong over his head and laid the pouch on the rough-hewn plank table that served as their altar. The others watched, confused, as he carefully untied the knot and unfolded a worn, creased document. It was a property deed, its ink faded with age, accompanied by an official survey map from the Montana Territorial Office. "This is the deed to a ranch called Whispering Pines. My ranch. Finch wanted it. I refused to sell, so he fabricated a rustling charge, had me arrested, and then had his man Jedediah Kane murder my wife and burn my home to the ground. This deed and the survey map tied to it is the one thing he overlooked. It's legal, ironclad proof that the foundation of his entire Montana operation is built on a lie and a murder." Sarah stared at the document, then at Silas's face, finally understanding the source of the cold fire in his eyes. He wasn't just a drifter caught in their fight. He was the first victim of the same plague that now beset them. "There's a man at Fort Grant," Silas continued, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "A U.S. deputy marshal named Elias Thorne. He's retired now, but his word still carries the weight of iron. He was a friend of my father's, a hard man but an honest one. I saw him once, years ago, after Amelia and I had just filed this deed. I promised her I would always uphold the law, that we would build our lives the right way on a foundation of honesty." He looked down at his calloused hands, hands that had become instruments of violence. "I broke that promise. I chose vengeance instead of justice. But if I can get this document to Thorne, he will see the truth. It's not just about my land anymore. It's a pattern. What Finch did to me, he's doing to you. This is the proof Thorne will need to bypass the corrupt judges and go straight to the territorial governor. He can bring the cavalry. He can bring the law." The weight of his words settled upon them. It was a desperate, razor-thin sliver of hope, but it required the impossible. "The road to Fort Grant is watched," K.L. said, his voice strained from the pain in his shoulder. "Kane's men will be on every ridge, at every pass. To ride that way is to ride into a death trap." "Which is why I won't take the road," Silas said, looking directly at the scout. "I need a path a ghost could take, through the canyons, over the broken lands. A path they won't be watching because they don't believe a man can survive it. You know that path, K.L." K.L. held his gaze for a long moment before giving a slow nod. He took a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and began to sketch a map on a loose floorboard, a network of winding lines and cryptic symbols that represented a secret, more dangerous route through the wilderness. "It will be slow, and you will have to travel by night, but it will keep you hidden from their eyes." A new alliance, a new plan was forged. Silas would make the perilous journey. He would carry the weight of their collective hope and the weight of his long broken promise. Sarah, Sheriff Miller, and the others would stay. They would fortify the town, set traps, and do the impossible. Hold off Kane's army for as long as it took. "Give us 2 days, Silas," Sarah said, her voice steady, her earlier recklessness replaced by a steely resolve. "Just get us 2 days." An hour later, under the cover of a moonless sky, Silas slipped out of redemption. He rode not his own tired bay, but the fastest horse from the livery, a dark-coated mare that would be nearly invisible in the night. Tucked securely in his saddlebags was the oilskin pouch containing the proof of Finch's sins and the last remnant of Jacob Kane's life. The journey was a descent into a special kind of hell. Kael's map led him through a labyrinth of jagged canyons and treacherous game trails, where a single misstep would send horse and rider plunging into the darkness. He rode through thickets of thorned mesquite that tore at his clothes and skin, and over vast stretches of alkali flats, where the silence was so complete it rang in his ears. He was haunted by more than the past. He was hunted in the present. Twice he had to freeze, dismounting and calming his horse in a cluster of rocks, as one of Kane's patrols rode past on a ridge above, their voices and the jingle of their spurs carrying unnervingly far in the still night air. He was a mouse moving through a field of hawks. During the day he hid, finding shelter in caves or deep ravines, resting the horse and trying to quiet his own mind. In those moments of forced stillness, the weight of his promise pressed down on him. He wasn't just riding for the people of redemption. He was riding for Amelia. He was trying to become, in this one desperate act, the man she had believed him to be. Not a vengeful killer, but a man of honor. The journey was not just a mission, it was a penance. On the morning of the second day, exhausted, dehydrated, and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, he crested the final ridge. Below him, nestled in a bend of the San Pedro River, flew the stars and stripes, Fort Grant. He urged the mare forward, pushing the last of her strength. He rode past the sentries, ignoring their shocked stares and shouted commands, and did not stop until he reached the commandant's office. He threw himself from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling, and stormed inside. An older man with a formidable white mustache and the clear, unwavering eyes of a lifelong lawman looked up from his desk. His face was weathered, his posture ramrod straight even while sitting. On his desk was a nameplate, E. Thorne. "Marshal Thorne?" he gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The old man's eyes narrowed, taking in Silas's ragged appearance. "I'm retired. Who are you?" Silas stood tall, and for the first time in 2 years, he spoke his own name. "My name is Jacob Kane, son of Isaac Kane, and I have a promise to keep." He tossed the oilskin pouch onto the marshal's desk. The weight of his journey was lifted. Now the weight of justice would fall on another man's shoulders.
The sky over Redemption began to bleed from black to a bruised pre-dawn purple. Inside the half-built church, there was no hope, only a grim, bone-weary resolve. Sarah knelt at a window, her father's rifle a familiar weight in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, but her hands were steady. Beside her, Sheriff Miller, a man reborn in the crucible of the siege, calmly loaded his shotgun. In the bell tower, Kael was a statue of silent pain, his wounded shoulder tightly bound, a fresh quiver of arrows laid out before him. They had survived the night. They had set traps, barricaded the street, and prepared for the end. They had done everything Silas had asked of them, everything except believe he would return in time. The 2 days Sarah had asked for were up. The dawn was coming, and with it, Alastair Finch's final bloody solution. This time Finch came himself. He watched from a high ridge on a magnificent black stallion, a general surveying the battlefield. He was flanked by Jedediah Kane and at least 30 riders, a small army assembled to crush a handful of defiant settlers. Finch's face, usually a mask of calm civility, was tight with cold fury. The resistance of redemption was not just a business obstacle, it was a personal insult. "No survivors, Jedediah," Finch commanded, his voice carrying on the still morning air. "Burn it all. I want this valley erased from the map." Kane smiled, a predator's grin. "With pleasure."
The attack began not with a charge, but with a volley of fire that splintered the barricades and tore through the wooden facades of the buildings. It was a storm of lead, designed to terrorize and obliterate. Under the cover of this relentless fusillade, Kane's men advanced, using dynamite to blast apart the makeshift defenses. The defenders returned fire, their shots measured and precise, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every one of Finch's men they hit, 3 more took his place. The sheriff went down first, a stray bullet catching him in the chest as he tried to fall back from the shattered windows of his office. He died with his shotgun in his hands, a lawman once more. Inside the church, the world was a nightmare of noise, dust, and splintering wood. A dynamite blast blew out the back wall, and Kane's men began to pour through the breach. Sarah fired until her rifle barrel was hot, fighting with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. Above them, Kael's bow sang a song of death, his arrows finding throats and eyes with unerring accuracy. But he was weakening, the strain of drawing the bow reopening his wound. It was then, as the first rays of the sun crested the eastern mountains, that a new sound cut through the cacophony of battle, the clear, clarion call of a cavalry bugle. For a moment, everyone froze. From the north, cresting the same ridge where Finch sat enthroned, a column of blue-coated riders appeared, their sabers catching the first light of dawn. They moved with the disciplined, unstoppable force of an avalanche. At their head rode 2 men, a grim-faced, white-mustached old lawman, and a ghost cloaked in dust and fury, Silas. The tide of the battle turned in a single thunderous heartbeat. The attackers, caught between the town's defenders and the charging cavalry, were thrown into chaos. Marshal Thorne's voice boomed over the battlefield, a voice of pure, righteous authority. "In the name of the United States government, lay down your arms. You're under arrest for insurrection and murder." For Finch's hired guns, loyalty ended where a cavalry saber began. Some threw down their rifles, others tried to flee, only to be cut down. But for the true architects of the conflict, the fight was not over. It had just become personal. As the cavalry swept through the main body of attackers, Silas broke away, his eyes locked on a single target. Jedediah Kane, seeing the battle was lost, was trying to fight his way out. Silas spurred his horse, cutting him off in the open space before the burning general store. The final, personal battle began. There was no finesse, just a brutal exchange of gunfire. Both men emptied their revolvers, diving from their horses and taking cover. Kane, roaring with rage, charged Silas with a bowie knife. Silas met him head-on, his own empty pistol used as a club. It was a savage, desperate fight in the dirt and mud. Kane was stronger, but Silas was fueled by 2 years of pure, distilled hatred. He saw Amelia's face in the flames, heard her last scream. He fought not like a man, but like an avenging spirit. He took a knife wound to his ribs, but barely felt it. He got inside Kane's guard, and the fight ended with the sickening crunch of bone. Silas stood over the body of his wife's murderer, his breath tearing at his lungs, the first part of his reckoning complete. But his eyes were already searching. He saw him. Alistair Finch, his civilized mask shattered, had abandoned his horse and was scrambling on foot up the rocky slope of the ridge, trying to escape the beautiful, terrible dawn. Silas followed, his movements stiff and painful. He found Finch cowering behind a cluster of boulders. The land baron, stripped of his men and his power, was just a man in a fancy suit, his face pale with terror. "Stay back!" Finch shrieked, fumbling for a small pearl-handled derringer in his coat. Silas stopped, standing 20 feet away. He didn't raise his gun. Instead, he reached into his own coat and pulled out the old, worn deed. He let it unfold in the morning breeze. "Do you remember me?" Silas asked, his voice raw. "The name is Jacob Kane. You came to my home, Whispering Pines. You offered me money for my land, for my life." Recognition, followed by sheer horror, dawned on Finch's face. "Kane, you're supposed to be dead." "Ghosts have a way of holding on," Silas said, his voice cold as a grave. He took a step forward. "You took everything from me, my wife, my name, my soul, all for a piece of paper." He let the deed fall from his fingers, a worthless token in the face of their final accounting. "We can make a deal," Finch pleaded, his composure gone. "I have money, influence. I can make you a rich man." "Your money is soaked in blood, Finch, and your bill has come due." As Silas took another step, a single desperate shot rang out. Not from Finch's derringer, but from below. One of Kane's wounded men, loyal to the last, had raised his rifle, aiming for Silas's back. "Silas!" Sarah's scream was a warning. But before the bullet could find its mark, a shadow moved in the bell tower. Kael, with the last of his strength, had drawn his bow one final time. His arrow flew, a streak of fletched lightning, and struck the rifleman in the chest. But in that same moment, a stray shot from the chaos below caught Kael, and he fell from sight without a sound. The sacrifice had been made. Finch saw his chance. As Silas was momentarily distracted, the land baron fired his derringer. The small-caliber bullet struck Silas high in the shoulder, staggering him, but it was a pinprick compared to the wound he had carried for 2 years. With a final guttural roar, Silas closed the distance. The reckoning was not a clean gunshot. It was brutal and absolute, a final settlement paid in the currency of violence that Alastair Finch had so freely spent. As the sun fully cleared the mountains, it illuminated a scene of quiet carnage. The fighting was over. Marshal Thorne and his men were rounding up the survivors. Sarah ran toward the church, her heart breaking for the silent scout who had saved them all. And on the ridge, Silas stood over the body of Alastair Finch, the rising sun at his back. He was wounded, exhausted, and more alone than ever before. He had settled his score. He had fulfilled the spirit, if not the letter of his promise. The reckoning was over. Jacob Kane was finally avenged, but the ghost named Silas was all that remained to see the new day dawn.
The silence that followed the storm was heavier than the battle itself. The rising sun illuminated a valley scarred by violence and littered with the debris of Alastair Finch's greed. The surviving cavalrymen, grim-faced and efficient, rounded up the prisoners, while Marshal Thorne, his face like carved granite, began the sober task of counting the dead. Redemption had survived, but it was a town of ghosts. Silas stood on the ridge, the cool morning breeze doing little to quell the fire in his shoulder and ribs. He watched the scene below not as a victor, but as a survivor of a shipwreck, marooned on the shore of his own vengeance. It was done. Finch was dead. Kane was dead. But the gaping hole in his soul remained, and the quiet satisfaction he had craved for 2 years was nowhere to be found. His gaze was drawn to the church. He saw Sarah emerge, her movements slow and deliberate, and walk to the base of the bell tower. She looked up, her face a mask of profound sorrow, and then knelt in the dust. She did not weep. Her grief was a quieter, harder thing now, aged a decade in a single dawn. He made his way down the slope, each step a painful reminder of the battle. By the time he reached the town, Marshal Thorne was waiting for him. Jacob Kane, the old lawman said, the name sounding foreign and strange. It's over. The documents you brought, combined with this insurrection, it's enough. We'll tear Finch's entire syndicate apart, root and stem. The law thanks you. Silas just nodded, his eyes still on Sarah. You have a choice, Thorne continued, his voice softening slightly. I can clear your name. The false charges in Montana will be expunged. You can have your life back. What's left of Whispering Pines is legally yours. The offer hung in the air, a phantom limb of a life that no longer existed. A home without Amelia was just a house. A name without the life it belonged to was just a word. There is no Jacob Kane. He died in a fire 2 years ago. Before Thorne could argue, Sarah approached them. She had a piece of Cale's buckskin shirt in her hand, a simple strip of leather and beads. She looked at Silas, her eyes conveying a depth of understanding that needed no words. We're burying the sheriff this afternoon, she said quietly. We'll bury Cale beside him, on the hill overlooking the creek. It's the best view in the valley. He deserved that. For the next 3 days, a strange peace settled over Redemption. It was the peace of exhaustion, of shared loss. The cavalry departed with their prisoners and a wagon carrying the dead, leaving Marshal Thorne and a handful of deputies to help restore order. The townsfolk, drawn together by the tragedy, began the Herculean task of rebuilding. They cleared debris, salvaged what they could from the general store, and held a solemn funeral for their fallen. Silas stayed, his wounds forcing a stillness he would not otherwise chosen. He watched as Sarah, no longer just a homesteader, became the town's heart. She organized work crews, rationed the supplies the cavalry had left, and comforted the grieving, her own loss channeled into a fierce maternal resolve to see Redemption rise from its ashes. On the third bay, she found him sitting on the steps of the half-built church, staring west. His wounds had been cleaned and bound, but a deeper wound remained. Thorne is leaving in the morning, she said, sitting beside him, careful not to jostle his injuries. He said you could ride with him. He wants you to testify. My testimony is lying dead on the ridge, he replied, his voice flat. Is that all it was about? The reckoning? She asked, her voice gentle. He was silent for a long time, watching as a hawk circled in the vast blue sky. He finally said, I made a promise to my wife that I would be a man of honor, a man of law. Instead, I became a killer. I broke my promise to her, and I broke the man I was supposed to be. No, she countered softly, but with an unshakable certainty. You lost your way, but you found it again. You brought the law to this valley, Jacob. You saved us. You honored her in the end. She used his real name, a quiet offering. He finally turned to look at her, truly seeing the woman she had become. The fear and reckless anger were gone, replaced with a strength that seemed to spring from the very land she was determined to rebuild. In her eyes she saw a glimmer of a future he could not have, a life of peace, of building something instead of tearing it down. It was a tempting vision, a warm hearth for a soul that had been cold for too long. But the ghost of Silas was not meant for warmth. He was a creature of the trail, of the wind and the dust. To stay would be to pretend he was a man he could no longer be. Redemption needs builders now, Sarah. I only know how to tear things down. She understood. There was sadness in her acceptance, but no pity. She held out her hand. In her palm was a single perfect hawk's feather, no doubt one that had fallen from Cale's quiver. "The wind blows where it will," she said, quoting a piece of scripture her father used to read. "You can't cage it, but you can remember the good it brought." He took the feather, his rough fingers gentle. It was a pardon, a farewell. The next morning, as the sun's first light touched the grave girts on the hill, Silas rode out. He did not ride with Marshal Thorne's deputies toward the world of laws and courtrooms. He rode west, toward the empty spaces, his back to the rising sun. Sarah stood on the porch of the half-built church and watched him go until he was just a dark speck against the immense landscape, a solitary figure who had appeared out of the horizon and was now returning to it. Years passed. The town of Redemption did not die. It thrived, built on a foundation of courage and loss. The half-finished church was completed, its bell ringing out over a valley that was prosperous and peaceful. New families came, drawn by the stories of the rich land and the brave folk who held it. The story of the siege at Crimson Creek became a local legend, a tale told by grandparents to wide-eyed children on long winter nights. They spoke of the brave Sheriff Miller, the quiet courage of Cale the scout who was buried as a hero, and the fierce homesteader girl Sarah who became the town's matriarch. And in that story there was always a chapter for the stranger. They said he came from nowhere, a ghost on the horizon, with eyes as cold as a winter sky. They said he fought like a demon, that he carried the weight of a terrible past, and that he asked for nothing in return. No one knew his real name, or where he came from, or where he went. His legend, stripped of the painful facts of Jacob Kane's life, became something purer, something mythic. He was the rider who came when all hope was lost, the righteous anger that cleansed the valley before vanishing as silently as he arrived, his true story dissolving into nothing more than a whisper on the wind.